This video will walk you through the key steps in order to stitch up the farmer and the snake. Now this is one of our more complicated designs, and so this video is quite detailed, but I hope will give you a solid grounding so you can refer to it at any point as you stitch. So the first place we're going to start is with the border. Now when you first start this, you'll feel like these leaves look pretty small. Don't worry too much as you start stitching. Each individual leaf will end up looking a little bit messy as you stitch. You see here I'm just filling in each one roughly with about 3 stitches. I'm not doing it in a particularly methodical way, and I'm working lengthways. As you start to build it up, and particularly once you add the chain stitch stem down the middle, it really all neatens up. On the guide I have shown you which colour to put where, say do 3 leaves of the light peach, but the main thing to achieve here is just a real randomness, so you absolutely don't need to follow the colour plan. You can do it kind of any way you'd like. The key thing though is to make sure you do the leaves before you do the stem that goes up the middle. Whilst you could do it after, it will end up just making it slightly harder, and part of the point of the stem is it really neatens down the middle of the leaves. So you see the way I'm working is I'm kind of doing a strand of each colour in order to fill out whole sections. You could go around and do, say, all the light peach, but I prefer to work like this because it means that I can then add a bit of chain stitch in this area before carrying on to the next. I just find it a more fun way to work when I can mix up the stitches more regularly. So you can see here that I'm using a chain stitch, and I'm using the link method here, which is my preferred way to work. But if you want to refer to separate videos, there's 2 separate videos showing you both methods of the chain stitch, so you can test them out on a scrap piece of fabric and see which way you prefer. Likewise, there's videos on every other step of the process, like getting started, splitting your thread, etc. So do refer to those if you're stuck on any of those particular areas. So you're just going to continue doing the border, producing the whole border in this way, with the exception just of the little flowers at the top. These ones here, which you can see are largely done in a satin stitch. So I'm just going to work on the outside first. You could work on the inside one first, it doesn't matter which way. And all I'm doing is I'm just doing a satin stitch across, quite full, and the aim is just to cover all the black background. The fuller some of these things are, it's quite nice because it gives a bit more of a 3D raised texture from the surface. Then I'm just going to use exactly the same method, using the orange to do the centre of the flower. And then once you've finished filling in the entire flower, what you're going to do is get your light brown, and you're just going to do a running stitch going round the outside. And the purpose of this is, firstly, it just neatens off and the flower, giving an outline, looks very neat. But also it helps if you've got any little patches of the white print on the fabric. It'll help cover them over so that at the end you can't see any little white marks, which is one thing we're keen to avoid. So you can see here one of the finished flowers, and I'm now just adding in these little leaves, the petals coming out of the flower in the peach. So the next bit I'm going to show you is how to do the tree and the snake. So I'm just going to start first with the trunk of the tree, and here I'm using a split stitch. And the main purpose of a split stitch is it creates quite a nice blended look. It helps you to achieve kind of filling large areas without having to use stitches that are too long. You can see here each of my stitches is maybe maximum 1.5 centimetres long, before I then go back and split it. Now I'm working in a sort of diagonal direction up the tree, but you can really work it any way just kind of work consistently in the same direction as you go. That helps it look neater and to have the sheen of the thread. If it's all going the same direction, it shines better. So then once I've finished doing the trunk, I'm going to add in the chain stitch. Again, just using the link method here. And I think it is best to do all this section before doing the snake, but it really doesn't matter too much. It just means you'll have something you know you're working up against when you start filling the snake in. So you can cover over any slightly messy edges or anything like that. One of the useful things with the chain stitch, just to make it look as smart as possible, is just to try keep the length of each chain stitch the same. That uniformity is one of the things that look quite neat. So then we're going to go in with the snake. And again, this is just now using a satin stitch. And I'm just working kind of horizontally across the body of the snake. I think it's the best way to work throughout this snake, is to keep that direction going. Now on these narrow sections, maybe you're different, but because of the type of fabric we're using, you might find it a bit hard to keep the stitches really uniform, or just so they look very smooth edged. Don't worry about this at all, because when you step away, you really don't notice any of these differences. So I think often I get the questions I have from people are that they're feeling a bit nervous about it not looking very neat. Really just keep going, and when you get towards the end, you'll start to see how neat it all looks when it all comes together. So you can see I'm just working here up in the dark red. Now one thing to point out is that there's not a peach line printed onto the fabric. You can add in the peach. It's one that I think is kind of either necessary or unnecessary. It doesn't really matter. So it's there as an option if you want to. And you can of course customize the snake, the design however you want. You could do sort of diamonds down it or anything really, whatever make it you want. If you want to make it your own. The final thing is, you see I'm just adding the snake's eye and mouth in, and just to make sure you're going to have to add these right at the end, just so you can stitch over the top of the threads that are already there. The tongue of the snake is just being done in a little running stitch. So you just continue doing that until you've then completed stitching the stake and the tree on the other side. I'm just going to show you a little bit of where the centre of the tree is, where they join together. Because one thing here is just to try and get the texture of them really winding over the top of each other. You just want to have some order about where the chain stitch goes. So you see here that I'm having this just jutting right up against the other bit. But one thing is, it's nice in this section if you can make sure that also the darker green stitches, which are on the branches themselves, are going in a slightly different direction, because it just helps the viewer to really differentiate that one's kind of coming forward and one's going away. So that is how you stitch up the snake and the trees. Now the next bit of the video I'm going to focus on a farmer, who is the most complicated part of this design. So you see I'm just starting with the tails of his coat, and this stripe is done in a chain stitch. So again I'm using the link method. You can test out the loop method, which you might find easier here when the two rows of chain stitch are all jutting up against each other. But the way I'm going to work is I'd go across and filling in the light peach first, and then you can go back and fill in the gaps. So here we come up with the light brown. And this is just relatively straightforward, the section you're filling in. Once you've got the grip of your chain stitch, you'll find this very straightforward to do. You can see throughout that I've ended up doing 2 rows of peach and 1 row of brown. I think that's the best way to fill it in. So then I'm just going to add in these scallops in a mid yellow, just working in a satin stitch. So once you've done all these scalloped areas, you'll also do the boots. And the boots, I'm not going to show you, but they are literally just the same stitch, a satin stitch. I think on the farmer it's best to work quite methodically. I quite liked working across the bottom section first, then working upwards. It helps you keep in the swing of things. So one thing just to quickly note is on this video you'll see there's a few more lines and things drawn on the design than on the one you've received. This is just because I started with a slightly more complicated idea and have reduced the design back in order just to make it a bit easier to stitch. Some of the elements were just too small. So here you can see again I'm just using a satin stitch to do these arrows at the bottom. I'm working in diagonal way each into the centre of each stitch. It just creates quite a nice texture. And you don't have to stitch it in this way, but I think it is one of the easiest ways to stitch it. So once you've finished doing all that, then you actually end up using the same colours in order to start doing the diamonds going up. And so these diamonds, I always find it easiest to work in diamonds starting from the long centre line and then working out from there. I think it's just a good way of achieving more uniformity across the shape of the diamond and making sure your centre falls in the right place. Sometimes if you work from a small corner outwards, you'll find your centre becomes a little bit off. As you stitch all of this, you're going to end up filling in the vast majority of all the black background. Therefore, one of the key things you just want to do is make sure you're covering over those little white lines. A little bit showing through, but really won't be noticeable at the end, but you just don't want to have too much showing. So here you can see on the either side of this, I've added in the orange running stitches. Now, for the main body of the farmer, I'm just going to show you how to do one of the little four quadrants. Once you've understood one, you'll easily be able to do the rest. So I'm just going to be showing you the bottom left quadrant. Here you can just see what I'm doing is I'm starting with the background colour first. I preferred this way of working because I think for me it meant I just had to work in one colour to begin with, and then I could slowly go back and kind of fill in the extra details, but it meant that it gave me a real good guide as I started working on the next bit. You can also fill it relatively roughly, don't worry about it being super precise. You see here how I've ended up actually cutting out a few petals from that flower, and the shapes of my leaves have changed really versus what's printed. I'm just doing a rough filling in because the overall look from a distance is of a lot of detail. Obviously if you're a very experienced stitcher, you could really go kind of mad in these little sections and try some different stitches, you know, lazy daisies and putting some French knots in. There's absolutely no reason you have to stitch them exactly the way I'm doing here. Okay, so you see there that I've got all the orange in. Now I'm going to start filling in the other little bits. So I'm starting with the light green. I'm going to fill in the bird's body. Now, one thing I always try to do on these is work in opposing directions with the direction of the thread. So you can see I was working left to right before, and now I'm working vertically. You might find this all a bit fiddly. Don't over stress about how neat it was all coming out. I know I say this a lot, but but it really does start looking neater once it's all finished and you can step back from it. So I'm basically just continuing this way of working across all the various elements. I'm going to show you the full video of it so you can refer to this at any point if you want to see kind of how mine's looking during the process. And then that's the section done. So you can see the other sections are just done in really the same way. It's all satin stitch. Just use your own creative license when you start filling them in if you want to use any other variety of stitch. I'm just going to now show you some other elements of the coat. It's all relatively straightforward, and by this stage you'll be pretty experienced at all the stitches. You can see here I'm just using a satin stitch to do these bands going across the coat. You could do this before you start doing the other sections, because then you might find that it's easier to kind of neaten off against the individual four quadrants. But I also add this running stitch over the top, just to tidy up any edges of the lines, and so you can't see kind of the slight unevenness with them not all in. Just a quick note that I was working on a heavier fabric on this, and therefore I was finding it a little hard to get the lines neat, whereas just reduce the weight of cotton to try and make it a bit easier for stitching. Then I'm adding chain stitch around the outside. Just importantly note that I would do this after I've finished the entire coat. The chain stitch is always, when it's used an outline, best to go on at the end. So I'm just going to show you on the section that I've finished. And then likewise, I'm now just adding in that running stitch along the outer edge of the two kind of diamond bands going down the sides of the coat. Now, one of the more complicated bits you'll think when you first start looking at these flowers, but really don't overthink these. I'm just creating each petal in roughly 2 stitches. The main thing is just making sure you cover over the white printing as you stitch them in. As you get to the top, the petals get smaller, so you'll definitely only need 1 stitch on them. The leaves I do in exactly the same way that I did the leaves on the border. So just some rough stitches going out. So they really are much simpler. If you are an experienced stitcher, you could go ahead and try using a lazy daisy stitch on these, or even if you're not, have a Google, you'll find a video on lazy daisy stitch and test practicing it. It would be a nice stitch to use there, but I'm deliberately trying to keep this simpler for any stitcher, so it's just that bit more relaxing. I want to introduce new stitches every single thing we use, or else it might find it a little bit exhausting. Then we're just going to go on to do his hat. And again, I'm just going to using a satin stitch here. You can see I'm a little bit chaotic with the direction. Sometimes I do stitches in, adding kind of certain narrower bits I've just done a couple of long stitches there on one of those fronds from the sun. But that's because I know I'm going to go back over the top in the light brown. And so I really don't mind that these individual sections might not look that neat, because it all neatens off when I add the light brown back in again. So as you can see here, I'm using a couple of long stitches, and so they're really covering over the corners of the rays from the sun. So it makes all the lines from the rays of the sun look a lot sharper. And then when it comes to doing his face, I'm just using a running stitch here, going around the outline. You could use a chain stitch too. Just using this simply to cover over the little white lines. And now I'm going to use the same colour to make his mouth and the stitch on his nose. Just keeping it really simple. What you could do is, if you wanted, you could also fill in the colour of his face. I think I quite like it being kept to raw base material, as it feels a slightly more folk arty aesthetic. I am also conscious as from distance sometimes then it sits back more. If you want, you could say fill that entire face in and then add the details over the top. There you can go, you can see the full hat done. And so there, now you can see I'm just going to add in his pipe. Now, this is slightly unnecessary amount of time spent on the stitching, but I really like, on all little narrow long lines like this, working horizontally across them. You could do a couple of long stitches, but I think this is where you just really start to see the amount of effort you put into a piece. Is these short stitches going across create a real 3D look, where sometimes a single long stitch doesn't have that same kind of 3D quality. And there you go. That's all the steps to stitch The Farmer and the Snake. Hope it helps, and get in touch if you have any questions.